Evelyn Carter pressed her palm flat against Patience's neck to stop her own hand from shaking. 3 months since the burial. 3 months of men looking through her like she was already gone. She walked through that ranch gate anyway, chin-up boots cracked heart in splinters. She didn't come to beg. She came because she had nowhere left to fall. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow every step of Evelyn's journey to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The gate to Reed Ranch stood 14 feet tall, and Evelyn Carter did not slow down when she reached it. She had been walking since 4 in the morning. The mule Patience, a gray-muzzled animal with a listing gait and one clouded eye, had pulled the small wagon through 6 miles of Wyoming summer without complaint, which was more than Evelyn could say for herself. She had complained quietly to no one somewhere around mile 3, when the sun crested the ridgeline and hit her square in the face like an open hand. She had said words her late husband Walter would have pretended not to hear. Then she had kept walking. The ranch spread out before her like something from a painting, not a soft painting, not the kind hung in parlors with velvet curtains, but the kind painted by a man who had actually been somewhere hard and wanted other people to know it. Dust everywhere, heat rising off the flat ground in visible waves, the smell of horses and hay, and something burned that might have been yesterday's supper or last week's luck. There were men working near the far fence line. 2 of them stopped and looked at her. Neither moved to help. Evelyn tied Patience to the post by the gate and straightened her headscarf. She smoothed her apron. She walked toward the main house with her spine as straight as she could manage, which was very straight because Evelyn Carter had been told all her life that the way a woman carried herself was the only currency nobody could take from her. A man came off the porch before she reached the steps. He was built wide across the shoulders, thick through the chest, with a face that had made peace with the sun somewhere around 30 and lost the argument. He had the look of a man who had been foreman of something his entire adult life and had decided that made him the final word on most subjects. "Help you," he said. The word help sounded like it cost him personally. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I'm looking for work. I heard Reed Ranch is running a full summer operation and might need hands in the cookhouse or with the stock." He looked at her the way a man looks at something left on his doorstep that he didn't order and doesn't want. "Cookhouse is managed," he said. "I can do more than cook." "I'm sure you can, ma'am." He said ma'am the way some men said it, as punctuation, not respect. "But we ain't running a charity operation here. This is a working ranch. Hard work. Early mornings, late nights, rough conditions." "I've been running a homestead since I was 19, Evelyn said. "My husband passed 3 months ago. I have experience with horses, cattle management, basic veterinary care, and enough cooking to feed 30 men without burning the beans." "That right?" It wasn't a question. "That's right." He crossed his arms. "And what does a widow woman expect to get paid for all that?" "A fair wage," she said. "Same as anyone else." He laughed, not cruelly worse than cruelly. Dismissively. The kind of laugh that says the conversation is already over and the other person just doesn't know it yet. "Tom Riggs," he said, not offering his hand. "I'm the foreman here, and I'm telling you polite as I know how, Mrs. Carter, that this ain't the place for you. Ranch work ain't." "I didn't ask your opinion of what it is," Evelyn said. Her voice didn't rise. That was one of the things she had learned in 25 years of living, that a raised voice gives the other person something to react to, and she didn't want to give Tom Riggs anything. "I asked for work. Is the owner of this ranch available, or is turning away qualified help something you do on your own authority?" Riggs's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth. "She can speak to me." The voice came from behind Riggs from the direction of the porch. Not loud, not sharp, just there the way a stone is there when you step on it unexpectedly and have to recalibrate everything. Riggs turned. Evelyn looked past him. The man on the porch steps was leaning against the post with his arms loose at his sides and his hat pushed back on his head. He was tall, not performatively tall, not the kind of tall that announces itself, but the functional kind, the kind that means he could reach the top shelf and look over fences and see things coming from a distance. Sun-darkened skin, brown eyes that moved across the situation with the unhurried assessment of someone who had seen enough emergencies to know which ones were actually emergencies. Caleb Reed. She recognized the name. Everyone within 40 miles recognized the name. Reed Ranch was the largest operation in Castor County. Had been his father's before him. Had nearly broken after a brutal winter 3 years back and come back stronger, which people said was either stubbornness or something like it. She had also heard the other thing people said about him. The things said in lower voices. That his wife had died. That he'd changed after. That he ran a good ranch and kept to himself and didn't attend church socials and didn't attend much of anything that required a smile. He came down the porch steps without hurrying and stopped a few feet from Tom Riggs. "Go check on the water situation in the north pasture," he said. "I told you this morning it needed looking at." "Boss, I know what you were just," Caleb said. "Go check on the water." Riggs went. He didn't look happy about it. But he went. Caleb Reed turned to Evelyn and looked at her for a moment. Not the way Riggs had looked at her, not the dismissive full-body scan that categorized and discarded, but the way a person looks at something they're genuinely trying to understand. "Evelyn Carter," he said. "Yes, sir." "Walter Carter's widow." She felt the sentence land somewhere in her chest and absorbed it the way she had learned to absorb those sentences. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Walter Carter ran good stock. I bought 2 horses from him 4 years back. Good animals. Healthy." "He knew horses," she said. "He did." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What did Riggs say to you?" "He said you weren't hiring." "Riggs doesn't do the hiring." He looked at her with that same still assessment. "What kind of stock work are you experienced with?" Something shifted in Evelyn's chest. Not hope exactly, because hope was a thing she was being careful with these days, rationing it like water in a dry summer. But something adjacent to hope, something that sat up and paid attention. "Horses primarily," she said. "Walter worked cattle, but I had more feel for the horses. Gentling basic training health assessment. I've pulled foals, set legs, talked down horses that other people had given up on." Talked down. "Some horses," Evelyn said carefully, "respond to patience more than force." Something moved in Caleb Reed's face. It was brief, and she almost missed it, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in the set of his jaw. "We have a situation with a horse," he said, "if you want to walk with me." She walked with him. He didn't explain until they were at the far paddock, the one set off from the main corrals by a separate fence and a gate that someone had reinforced more than once, judging by the number of new boards on it. And then she saw why. The black mare was probably the most beautiful horse Evelyn had ever seen, and also clearly the most dangerous. She stood at the far end of the paddock alone because anything she was likely to share space with had apparently been moved away from her. Midnight black from nose to tail, well-muscled, deep-chested, with the kind of bone structure that made experienced horse people stop talking and just look. She moved with the coiled electric energy of something that was deciding at every moment whether to flee or fight. "Shadow," Caleb said. "Bought her 6 weeks ago from a horse trader out of Colorado. Papers say she's 5 years old, well-bred, should be well-suited to this terrain and climate." He paused. "She has not in 6 weeks allowed anyone to shoe her." Anyone being? Every man on this ranch has tried. He said it without particular pride or embarrassment, just fact. Riggs, 3 of the hands the farrier from town. She put 2 of them on the ground. Farrier took 14 stitches. Evelyn looked at the mare. The mare stood with her head high and her ears at a sharp, rigid angle, tracking every movement around the paddock like she was counting exits and calculating odds. "What happens when someone approaches her?" Evelyn asked. "Depends on her mood. Sometimes she just runs the fence until they give up. Sometimes she charges. Once she—" He stopped. "She's not predictable." "Has anyone hurt her before you bought her?" A beat of silence. "The trader denied it, but the way she responds to ropes—" He stopped again. "I believe she may have been handled rough at some point." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was watching the mare's ears, watching the way her weight shifted on her back legs, watching the thing that nobody else was probably watching, which was the way the mare's nostrils worked, not with aggression, but with something that looked, if you knew horses, less like fury and more like fear wearing fury's clothes. "I'd like to try to work with her," Evelyn said. "Not today, not this week, just work with her." "You'd be employed for other duties in the cookhouse and general ranch work," Caleb said. "What you do with your own time on your own terms with that horse is—" He paused. "Something I'd be willing to observe." "And the position." He looked at her steadily. "Room and board and fair wage. Same as anyone else." Evelyn breathed out slowly so he wouldn't see it. "When do I start?" "Hey, you're already here," Caleb said. He turned back toward the main house. "I'll have Riggs show you the bunkhouse arrangements." "Mr. Reed." She said it before she'd decided to. He stopped and turned. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment with those still brown eyes, and something in his expression was complicated in a way she didn't have the translation for yet. "Don't thank me," he said. "Shadow put 2 men in the dirt and the farrier in the doctor's office. If she does the same to you, I'll have a harder situation than I started with." He walked away. Evelyn looked back at the black mare. Shadow was watching her. Not the way she'd watched the men, not with that electric calculating fury. She stood at the far fence with her head slightly turned, looking at Evelyn sideways, the way a horse looks when it is actually looking, when it wants to see something but isn't willing to admit it wants to. Evelyn had seen that look before. She had seen it on the face of a horse that Walter had brought home, half-starved and shaking from a bad handler, the horse she'd spent 8 months bringing back. She'd seen it on the face of every creature that had ever been hurt badly enough to stop trusting, but hadn't quite not yet stopped hoping. She knew what that look meant. It meant, "I'm listening. But if you're going to be like the rest of them, say so now, and save us both the time." "I'm not like the rest of them," Evelyn said quietly. To herself, maybe, or to the horse, or to the county of Castor and the summer of 1886, and the 6 miles of road behind her, and the 3 months of people looking through her like she was already gone. She turned and walked toward the main house to find Tom Riggs, and she did not look back because she already knew Shadow was still watching. The cookhouse ran from 4 in the morning until the last man left the table, and Evelyn discovered in her first week that no one had been running it with any particular system for at least the past month. The previous cook, a man named Garrett, who Tom Riggs mentioned with the specific vagueness people use when someone has left badly, had apparently operated on instinct and spite. The storeroom was badly organized. The supply lists were inaccurate. There was cornmeal in a barrel that had no business being cornmeal anymore, and a situation with the salt pork that Evelyn dealt with efficiently and did not describe to anyone. She restructured it in 4 days. She didn't announce that she was restructuring it. She simply did it the way she had learned to do most things, quietly, methodically, in the spaces between being observed. The ranch hands noticed before Riggs did. "This is different," said a young hand named Pete on the 3rd morning, looking at his plate with the confusion of a man who has been eating bad food long enough to have stopped expecting anything else. "Eat it before it gets cold," Evelyn said. "I'm not complaining. I'm just, is this actual gravy?" "It is." "With the biscuits?" "Yes, Pete." He ate 4 biscuits. She counted. Riggs noticed at the end of the first week, when the complaints he was accustomed to hearing about the food, about the supply shortages, about various cookhouse-related grievances, stopped coming. He came and stood in the cookhouse doorway on a Thursday morning and looked at the organized shelves and the clean prep surfaces and the orderly stack of supply records Evelyn had started keeping, and his face did something complicated. "This is adequate," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Riggs. I didn't say it was good." "You said it was adequate. That's a start." He looked at her with narrowed eyes, trying to determine if she was being smart with him. She met his gaze pleasantly and waited. He left without saying anything else. She allowed herself a small private satisfaction, the kind she'd learned to keep internal, and went back to the biscuit dough. What she did not tell Tom Riggs, because he had not asked, and because some information was better kept close, was that she spent every evening after supper cleanup in the far paddock, not inside it. She didn't go inside the paddock, not in that first week. She sat on the top rail of the fence, cautiously the first night, with one leg still on the outside in case she needed to move fast, and she did nothing. She just sat there. Shadow watched her from the far side of the paddock with those high-alert ears and that coiled spring readiness. For 30 minutes the first night. For 25 minutes the second. On the third night the mare moved from the far fence to the middle of the paddock and stood there still as something carved, watching Evelyn not move. Evelyn did not move. On the fourth night she brought an apple. She did not offer it. She ate half of it herself, slowly sitting on the fence rail, while the summer dark came down and the ranch went quiet around her, and she put the other half on the fence post beside her and left it there when she went in. In the morning, the apple was gone. Caleb Reed saw her on the fence on the fifth evening. He had come from the north pasture after a long day dealing with a fence break and the subsequent cattle situation, and he was tired in the bone-deep way that had less to do with physical effort than with the particular exhaustion of being responsible for many things at once. He was walking toward the main house when he saw the figure on the far paddock fence, and he stopped. She was sitting sideways on the rail, completely still, in the last copper light of the evening. Shadow was in the middle of the paddock. The distance between them was maybe 30 feet, maybe less. The mare was not running the fence. She was not charging. She was not doing any of the things she did when men approached. She was standing in the middle of the paddock, and she was, unless Caleb was mistaken, facing in Evelyn Carter's direction of her own choosing. He stood at the corner of the barn and watched for a long moment. He told himself he was assessing a ranch situation. He was not sure he believed himself. After a while, Evelyn took something from her apron pocket and set it on the fence post. She climbed down from the fence carefully without sudden movement and walked back toward the main house along the fence line. She passed close enough to where he stood that he could have said something. He didn't say anything. She went inside. He stood for another moment looking at the paddock where Shadow had moved to the fence line and was standing with her head extended toward the fence post where Evelyn had left whatever she'd left. He walked to the main house and went inside and sat at his desk and looked at the account books for a while without reading them. He had not expected this. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, which he tried to be, because dishonesty with oneself was a particular kind of slow damage, he had expected her to try and fail. He had expected Shadow to reject her, the way Shadow had rejected everyone else, and he had expected Evelyn Carter to accept the rejection with the quiet dignity she seemed to carry everywhere and redirect herself toward the cookhouse work, which she was doing extremely well, and that would be that. He had not expected whatever was happening in the far paddock. He had not expected either the thing that had happened in the first moment he'd seen her, the widow with the cracked boots and the straight spine, standing in front of Tom Riggs's dismissal, like she was made of something that dismissal couldn't get purchase on. He had not expected to feel anything about that. He had not expected to feel much about anything for some time. He had grown accustomed to the absence of feeling, had arranged his days to accommodate. It had accepted that this was the shape of his life going forward. He closed the account books and went to bed. In the morning, when he passed the paddock on his way to the north fence work, he saw the apple core on the ground inside the fence. Shadow had come to the fence in the night and taken it. Tom Riggs had opinions, and unlike some men, he shared them freely. "You know what people are saying in town?" he said to Caleb on Friday afternoon, when the men had gone to supper, and the two of them were reviewing the week's supply numbers. "I generally don't put much stock in what people say in town," Caleb said. "They're saying—" Riggs paused with the particular weight of a man who wants to make clear he personally finds this distasteful, but feels duty-bound to pass it along. "They're saying it ain't proper. A widow woman living on a working ranch, without family, without, Without what, Tom? Without proper arrangements." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "She has a room in the bunkhouse annex. Same arrangement we'd make for any cook who needed to be on site before 4 in the morning. "I know that." "Then you know the arrangements are proper." "I know it," Riggs said again. But Eleanor Stanton's been talking. You know how she talks. Caleb did know how Eleanor Stanton talked. Eleanor Stanton was the wealthiest widow in Castor and had opinions about the management of other people's lives, with which she was extremely generous. Eleanor Stanton can talk, he said. Has Mrs. Carter done anything to give anyone actual cause for concern? No, Riggs admitted. She runs a tight cookhouse, I'll give her that. Men aren't complaining. Even Pete's being less useless, I think, because she feeds him decently. He paused. It's just the talk is all. Town talk. Is there anything about this ranch that you'd like to be running differently, Tom? A beat of silence. No. Then I'll worry about the work, Caleb said, and Eleanor Stanton can worry about whatever Eleanor Stanton worries about. That's about as much as either of us can manage. Riggs went. Caleb sat with the supply numbers and thought about straight spines and cracked boots and apple cores on the paddock ground. And then he stopped thinking about it and went back to the supply numbers, because there was a lot of summer left and a great deal of work to do. On the afternoon of the 14th day, Evelyn went into the paddock, not with a lead rope, not with shoes or tools, just with herself, and in her apron pocket, an apple and a small piece of dried corn cake, which she had noticed horses sometimes found interesting. She came through the gate slowly. She did not look directly at Shadow. She understood from years of working with horses, and from something more instinctual than knowledge, that direct eye contact was a declaration, and she was not there to declare anything. She was there to be present and unthreatening and patient, which were three things she had in the past 3 months become very good at. Shadow ran the fence. Evelyn sat down on the ground in the middle of the paddock. She sat cross-legged in the dirt in her patched dress and her cracked boots, and she put her hands in her lap, and she waited. Shadow ran the fence for 8 minutes. Evelyn knew because counting was something to do that kept the rest of her mind quiet. Then Shadow stopped running. The mare stood at the far fence and looked at the woman sitting in the dirt and breathed hard for a moment. Then she took one step toward the center. Evelyn did not move. Another step. She sat on the ground with her hands in her lap, and she thought about Walter, because sometimes she let herself do that controlled and deliberate, the way you open a window to let air in when the room gets too close. She thought about his hands and the sound of his laugh, and the way he'd looked at her the morning they married, like she was something he couldn't quite believe was real. She thought about the shape of him in the chair by the fire in the evening, and the absence of that shape, the terrible persistent absence of it, and she breathed slowly and let the grief move through her like water moves through good soil, taking what it takes, leaving what it leaves. Shadow was 10 feet away when Evelyn looked up. The mare had stopped again. She stood with her head low, not aggressive low, not I'm about to charge low, but curious low, interested low. The posture of a horse that has decided something has changed and is trying to figure out what. Evelyn took the apple from her pocket. She held it out on her flat palm. She did not move toward the horse. Shadow's nostrils worked. One ear rotated forward. For 2 full minutes, nothing happened. Then the black mare took the last 10 feet in 3 slow steps, dropped her head, and took the apple from Evelyn's palm. Her nose was warm and dry against Evelyn's skin. Her breath came in slow pulls. She stood and chewed, and did not bolt, and when Evelyn so slowly raised her other hand and placed it gently on the mare's jaw, Shadow did not move. She stood there and accepted the touch. Evelyn sat in the dirt of the paddock with her hand on the black mare's jaw, and felt something in her chest break open and rearrange itself into something new. Not better than what she'd had before. Not a replacement for it, but different. A small hard knot of purpose that had been forming somewhere below her grief for 3 months, finding its shape. She did not make a sound. Neither did the horse. Outside the paddock fence in the shadow of the barn where he'd stopped on his way from somewhere to somewhere else. Caleb Reed stood very still and watched the widow with the straight spine sit in the dirt of the far paddock with her hand on the face of the horse that had sent the farrier to the doctor. And he felt something he had not felt in 3 years move in his chest, like a door pushed open by wind. He turned and walked back the way he'd come before she could see him watching. The morning after, Evelyn sat in the dirt with Shadow Tom Riggs, called her useless in front of 4 men. He didn't use that exact word. He was more careful than that. What he said was, "I don't know what kind of operation you were running at your homestead, Mrs. Carter, but on this ranch we don't have time for women sitting in the dirt playing games with horses that ought to be put down." He said it loud enough for Pete and the other hands to hear, and he said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for an opportunity and believes he has found one. Evelyn was carrying a basin of wash water at the time. She set it down carefully. She turned around. "Has the cooking been inadequate, Mr. Riggs?" she asked. "That's not the point. Has the storeroom been mismanaged? Have the supply records been inaccurate? Has any man on this ranch gone without a meal or a clean workspace? That's not. Then I'm not sure what game you're referring to," Evelyn said. "Because what I see from where I'm standing is a cookhouse that's running better than it was when I arrived, and a horse that took an apple from my hand yesterday for the first time since anyone on this property has tried. If that's a game, I'd like to know what the winning looks like to you." Pete made a sound that might have been a cough. Riggs's face went the particular color it went when he felt outmaneuvered. "You watch yourself," he said. "This ain't your ranch." "I know whose ranch it is," Evelyn said. She picked up the basin and carried it where she was going. Behind her she heard Pete say something to the man beside him, too quiet to catch. She didn't need to catch it. She could tell by the sound of it. She kept walking. What she did not let Riggs see, what she had become expert at not showing, was that her hands were trembling. Not from fear. From the particular effort of staying measured when everything in her wanted to be something louder. Walter used to tell her that her temper was a fine horse, that she kept on too short a rein, and she had always argued with him about it, and she missed arguing with him about it so much that some mornings the missing of it sat on her chest like a stone. She set the basin down around the corner of the cookhouse where no one could see her and breathed. Then she went back to work. The second week moved faster than the first. Word had gotten around among the hands about what had happened in the paddock. Not the full picture, not Evelyn sitting in the dirt for 20 minutes while Shadow ran the fence. Not the mare taking the apple from her palm, but something. Ranch gossip traveled at the speed of boredom, and there was enough boredom between fence work and feeding to carry a story further than it deserved. What the hands had decided, in the way that groups of working men decide things, was that they were cautiously impressed, not convinced, not ready to say anything directly to Evelyn's face, except Pete, who had no internal filter and said most things directly to most faces, but cautiously impressed. "She going to actually shoe her?" Pete asked on the Wednesday morning, sitting at the cookhouse table with his third biscuit. "I don't know," Evelyn said. "Tom says it can't be done. Says the horse is just bad." "Horses aren't bad," Evelyn said. "They're responding to something. The horse that looks bad has usually got a reason." Pete thought about this with the slow thoroughness of a young man encountering an idea that doesn't quite match what he's been told. "My daddy used to say some horses were just born contrary. And some people used to say the earth was flat," Evelyn said pleasantly. "We managed to correct that." Pete stared at her. Then he laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She refilled his coffee without being asked. That afternoon she went back to the paddock. Shadow came to the fence rail within 4 minutes. Not running, walking with that low, curious posture, ears forward. Evelyn stood on the outside of the fence and let the mare sniff her hands, her sleeve the side of her headscarf. She held still through all of it, through the warm push of breath and the exploratory pressure of the mare's nose. And when Shadow pulled back to think about what she'd found, Evelyn said quietly, "I know. I don't smell like anyone else here. That's the point." The mare's ear rotated. "I'm going to start with your feet next week," Evelyn said. "Not shoes, just your feet. Just getting used to the idea." Shadow blew out a breath. "I know," Evelyn said. "Nobody asked you. But here we are." She didn't know if she was talking to the horse. The third week brought heat that turned the ranch into something that moved slow and breathed shallow, the kind of heat that makes men short-tempered and horses restless, and the water in the troughs go warm by mid-morning. Evelyn was up before the heat got its full grip on the day, which meant she was up at 3:30, which meant she slept less than was probably wise, which she dealt with by drinking more coffee than was definitely wise, which Pete noted and said nothing about, because Pete had developed a system of careful observation regarding things Evelyn Carter did that he thought were none of his business. He was learning. It was in the third week that Eleanor Stanton came to the ranch. Evelyn heard the buggy before she saw it, the particular clipped rhythm of a well-kept horse on a maintained road, the sound of something that cost money announcing itself. She was in the cookhouse when it pulled up, and she watched through the window as a woman in a black dress descended from the buggy with the assistance of a driver who had clearly been opening carriage doors for a long time. Eleanor Stanton was 50 years old and had been the most prominent widow in Castor County for 8 of them, a status she maintained with the same active attention that other people applied to their businesses. She had her late husband's money and her own opinions, and a social reach that extended through every church auxiliary and ladies' society in the county, which meant she had reach everywhere that mattered in Castor, because the church auxiliaries and ladies' societies were where the decisions about social standing were actually made, regardless of what anyone said about who held legal authority. Evelyn did not go out to greet her. That wasn't her place. She stood in the cookhouse and watched Tom Riggs come off the porch to receive her, and watched Riggs gesture toward the house, and watched Eleanor Stanton glance just briefly, just once toward the cookhouse window. The glance was the kind that meant, "I already know you're in there." Evelyn turned back to her work, Whatever was said in the main house took 40 minutes. Evelyn knew because she tracked it not obsessively, she told herself just practically the way you track a weather system when you're working outside. At the end of 40 minutes, Eleanor Stanton came out of the house and got back into her buggy and drove away without looking at the cookhouse again, which meant she'd already seen enough. Riggs found Evelyn an hour later. "Mrs. Stanton has concerns?" he said with the delivery of a man who shares the concerns and is glad someone else is voicing them. "I'm sure she has many concerns," Evelyn said. "She seems like a woman of broad interests. She's concerned about the appropriateness of your situation here." Evelyn set down the pot she was holding. She turned around and looked at Riggs directly. "My situation," she said, "is that I cook for this ranch, I manage the supplies, and I spend my personal time working with a horse. What part of that is Mrs. Stanton concerned about? You know what part." "I'd rather hear it said plain." Riggs shifted. "She thinks it ain't proper. A woman alone on a working ranch in close proximity to—" He stopped. "To the ranch owner?" Evelyn said. "That's what she said." "And what did Mr. Reed say?" Riggs paused. Something flickered in his expression. "He said it wasn't Mrs. Stanton's ranch." Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort exactly. Something more complicated. "Then I'm not sure what there is to discuss," she said. Riggs looked at her for a long moment. "You're tougher than you look," he said. It came out half grudging, half something else. "Most people are," Evelyn said, and went back to work. That evening, Caleb found her at the paddock fence and stopped beside her without announcing himself the way he had developed a habit of doing. Not sneaking, not deliberately silent, but quiet in the way of a man who had spent many years in spaces that required observation rather than noise. Shadow was at the center of the paddock. She looked up when Caleb arrived, tracked him with her ears held her position. 3 weeks ago she would have run the fence. "Mrs. Stanton paid the visit," he said. "I know." "I imagine Riggs told you." "He relayed her concerns," Evelyn said carefully. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He had his forearms resting on the fence rail and was looking at Shadow with the same kind of still attention he gave to most things. "Eleanor Stanton has been managing other people's reputations since before I was born," he said. "She managed my mother's. She managed my wife's." He paused. "She means well. That doesn't always make her right." It was the first time he had said anything about his wife to Evelyn. She did not react because she understood instinctively that reacting was the wrong thing to do, that this was a door opened very slightly, and that the way to keep it open was to be very still. "Her concerns don't affect your position here," Caleb said. "I want you to know that." "I appreciate you saying it." He was quiet again. Then, "How is she, Mom?" "Shadow." "Yes. She took an apple from my hand 3 days ago," Evelyn said. "Today she let me touch her neck for approximately 40 seconds before she moved away. Tomorrow, I'm going to start letting her get comfortable with something near her feet. Not touching, just near." "You're going slow." "I'm going at her pace," Evelyn said, "which is different from going slow." Caleb looked at her. That brief, complicated expression moved across his face again. "What's the difference?" "Going slow is my choice," Evelyn said. "Going at her pace means she's making some of the choices. It's the difference between a horse that tolerates something and a horse that accepts it. Shadow's been forced. Whatever happened to her before you bought her, someone forced something on her that she wasn't ready for. She doesn't need another person taking control. She needs someone to follow her lead for a while." Caleb was very quiet for a moment. Shadow moved closer to the fence, 3-4 steps, and stopped. "That's an interesting way to think about it," he said. Evelyn wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that. She suspected he might mean more than one thing. She let it sit. "Garrett," Caleb said abruptly. "The cook before you. You asked Riggs about him once." "He mentioned the name. I didn't ask. He was hired on poor references and worse judgment," Caleb said. "He tried to shoe Shadow himself without the farrier. Said he'd handled difficult horses before. She put him through the paddock fence." He paused. "He wasn't badly hurt, but he left. He said the horse was dangerous and the ranch was he used some language I won't repeat to a lady." "You don't have to protect me from language, Mr. Reed." Something shifted in his expression. Almost a smile. "Not quite. He said the ranch was cursed and the owner was a man who'd turned inward on himself like a bad tooth, and that he wanted no part of either." The near smile flickered. He wasn't entirely wrong about some of it. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I don't believe ranches are cursed." "No, I believe they go through hard times," she said. "And I believe the people on them sometimes go through hard times at the same time, and that makes everything look like a pattern when it might just be coincidence and bad luck stacking up." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Shadow was at the fence now, 4 feet from where they stood, her head over the rail with her ears in that curious forward position. "She's never come to the fence when I'm here," he said quietly. Evelyn looked at the mare. Shadow's attention was divided between Evelyn and the man beside her, but she hadn't retreated. "She's deciding," Evelyn said. "She watches you from a distance because she's seen you around the ranch, and she's assessed that you're not going to do anything sudden. She's just checking whether the combination of both of us changes that." "And does it?" "Ask her," Evelyn said. She stepped back half a pace deliberately, giving Caleb the fence rail. He looked at her. Then he looked at the mare. Very slowly, he reached out one hand palm up and held it just at the rail. Shadow's nostrils worked. Her ears went back then forward again. She didn't come to his hand, but she didn't leave. "Patience," Evelyn said quietly. "I'm being patient." "I know. I was talking to the horse." He laughed. It was a short sound, quieter than most laughs, a little unpracticed, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a while. But it was real. Shadow's ear rotated toward the sound. Evelyn looked at the side of his face and thought, "There you are." And then she looked back at the horse, because that was the safer direction. The first time Tom Riggs saw Evelyn handle Shadow's feet, he stood at the paddock fence and watched without saying a word for 7 full minutes. It was the 4th week. She had spent 3 days letting the mare get comfortable with a rope lying near her feet. Not on her feet. Not wrapped. Just present. Just there. Shadow had snorted at it, kicked at it twice, stood over it with her ears in maximum alarm for 1 full afternoon, and then eventually decided the rope was not her enemy and went back to her hay. On the 4th day, Evelyn picked up Shadow's front left foot. Not for long. Not to do anything. Just to pick it up, hold it for 10 seconds while she breathed steadily and talked in a low, continuous murmur about nothing in particular: the weather, the biscuits she'd made that morning, the way Pete had eaten 6 of them without pausing to breathe and then set it down gently. Shadow stood through it. Her muscles were coiled. Her breathing was fast, but she stood. "Good girl," Evelyn said. "Good girl. Look at that." She picked up the foot again, held it longer, set it down. She was on the 3rd repetition when she became aware of Riggs at the fence. She didn't look at him. She kept her attention on Shadow and her voice level and her movements smooth. When she stepped back and let the mare move freely, she turned and found Riggs still there. His arms were crossed. His jaw was working like he was chewing on something. "How'd you get her to stand for that?" he said. "I didn't get her to do anything," Evelyn said. "I asked, and I waited until she was ready to answer." Riggs was quiet for a moment. "Farrier's coming back next week," he said. "To try again. Reed scheduled it." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "She's not ready for the Farrier yet." "Reed scheduled it." "I understand, but she's not ready." Riggs's jaw tightened. "You gonna tell him that?" "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "I am." He looked at her for a moment. "You're real sure of yourself," he said. Not unkindly, just noting. "I'm sure of her," Evelyn said. "That's different." She told Caleb at supper, not in front of the men, but after, when the cookhouse had emptied and she was cleaning up, and he came in with the look of a man who has come ostensibly for coffee but has something on his mind. "The Farrier," she said before he could start. "I know you scheduled him." Caleb poured himself coffee and leaned against the doorframe. "She needs shoes before the fall work starts," he said. "I know that. She still needs 2 more weeks. The Farrier's coming from Billings. It's a full day's travel." "Then he can stay the night and try the following morning," Evelyn said. "I'll have her ready. But if he comes at her before she's ready, we're back to where we started, and maybe worse because she'll have been startled again." "One bad experience can undo 3 weeks of work, Mr. Reed. I've seen it happen." He was quiet, drinking his coffee, looking at her with that still assessment. "You're very confident in your read of that horse." "I'm very confident in what I've watched her do every day for 3 weeks," Evelyn said. "That's not confidence. That's evidence." Something moved in his expression. "2 more weeks," he said. 2 more weeks. He drank his coffee. He didn't leave immediately, which she had come to notice was a pattern that he came in with a purpose, addressed the purpose, and then stayed a few minutes longer than the purpose required. She had stopped analyzing it and started simply accepting it the way you accept good weather, without demanding to know how long it will last. "Eleanor Stanton is hosting a social next Saturday," he said. "I heard. She'll expect the ranch to be represented." "She'll expect you to be there," Evelyn said. "Probably." He was looking at his coffee cup. "The last social I attended, she spent 40 minutes telling me that grief has a proper season and that Walter's widow—" He stopped. His expression did something complicated. "That wasn't, I apologize. I wasn't thinking." "It's all right," Evelyn said quietly. "You were going to say she spent 40 minutes telling you that grief has a proper season and that you ought to be thinking about the future, yes?" "She said something similar to me," Evelyn said. "At Walter's burial. She meant it kindly, I think." "Eleanor always means things kindly," Caleb said. "That doesn't make them easier to receive." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It doesn't." They were quiet for a moment in the empty cookhouse. 2 people with the same particular shape of absence in their lives. And neither of them said anything about that, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. "I'll have the coffee ready at 4:30 tomorrow," Evelyn said finally. "I'll be there," Caleb said. He set his cup down. He went to the door, stopped. "Mrs. Carter." "Mr. Reed." "For what it's worth," he said. "I think you're right about the horse." He went. Evelyn stood in the cookhouse and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 months. Something she didn't have a clean word for. Something that sat alongside grief rather than replacing it. Something that had the shape of a future rather than the shape of an ending. She cleaned the last cup. She hung it on its hook. She went to bed. Saturday came, and with it the Eleanor Stanton social, and with that trouble. Evelyn had not planned to attend. She had no reason to attend. She was ranch help, not company, and she understood the distinction clearly enough to have no illusions about which category Eleanor Stanton's invitation list included. But Pete had left his good jacket at the social hall last month and asked Evelyn if she'd ride along with the wagon to pick it up, and she'd said yes because Pete was 22 and constitutionally incapable of practical planning, and someone had to. So she was there, in the back of the supply wagon, in her cleanest dress, which was still a patched gray when the wagon pulled up to the social hall, and she handed Pete down his jacket and turned to go wait at the wagon. Eleanor Stanton was on the steps. "Mrs. Carter," she said with the smile of a woman who has prepared for this moment. "How unexpected." "Mrs. Stanton," Evelyn said. "I was just returning Pete's jacket. I'll leave you to your—" "You must come in," Eleanor said. "Just for a moment. The ladies have been asking about you." She said it warmly. She said everything warmly. That was the skill of it. "I don't think that's appropriate," Evelyn said. "Nonsense. You're a widow woman new to the county. Of course people want to make you welcome." She gestured toward the door. Her expression said, "If you refuse, you'll look like you have something to hide." Evelyn understood the game. She also understood that refusing was worse than playing it. She went in. What happened next was that Eleanor Stanton introduced her to 7 women in 15 minutes, and 6 of those women managed within those 15 minutes to ask some version of the following question. How did she find it living at Reed Ranch, all alone with the men? And was Mr. Reed as reclusive as they'd heard? And wasn't it a particular situation for a widow woman of her circumstances? Evelyn answered pleasantly and revealed nothing, and smiled until her face ached. The 7th woman was different. Her name was Clara Morse, and she was around Evelyn's age, and she had the look of someone who has been in rooms like this many times and has stopped performing for them. She shook Evelyn's hand and said, "You're the one who's working with Shadow." Evelyn blinked. "Yes. My husband sold 2 horses to Reed last spring," Clara said. "He came back and told me about the black mare. Said no one could touch her." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "He said a woman talked the mare into eating out of her hand inside 2 weeks. He seemed unsettled by it." "Men often are," Evelyn said carefully. "When a horse they've dismissed does something unexpected." Clara Morse laughed, a real one. "Yes," she said, "they are." She leaned slightly forward. "Be careful with Eleanor," she said quietly. "She's not malicious, but she has a plan for Caleb Reed's future, and it doesn't currently include a widow woman from the North Range." Evelyn looked at her. "What plan?" "Her niece," Clara said. "From Philadelphia, arriving in September." She straightened up and smiled pleasantly as Eleanor Stanton drifted toward them. "Lovely party, isn't it?" she said loudly. Evelyn walked back to the supply wagon 45 minutes later with a great deal more information than she'd arrived with, and a particular uncomfortable weight settled between her shoulders that she told herself was nothing and did not entirely believe. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way Caleb Reed had looked at her in the empty cookhouse. She told herself this with some firmness. She climbed into the wagon beside Pete, who was wearing his recovered jacket despite the heat because he was very pleased to have it back. "How was it?" he asked. "Educational," Evelyn said. Pete squinted at her. "That bad? Drive the wagon, Pete," she said. He drove the wagon. On the last day of the 4th week, she asked Caleb to be present at the paddock. "I want Shadow to see that you trust me," she said. "She watches you. She's been watching you for weeks, tracking whether you react to me with any kind of tension or uncertainty. Horses read us sideways. They don't see what we say, they see what we feel. If you stand at that fence relaxed and easy, she'll read that, and it'll help." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You want me to stand at the fence and be relaxed?" "And easy." "I can do that." He came to the fence that evening. He stood with his forearms on the rail, the way he had that first evening, hat pushed back, not performing anything. And it was, she had to admit, watching it, genuinely easy. Not a man pretending to be comfortable. A man who was actually comfortable or close enough that Shadow, with her precise and unforgiving radar, wouldn't be able to tell the difference. She went into the paddock with the rope and the hoof pick. Shadow watched. Shadow watched Caleb. Shadow watched Evelyn. Shadow's ears moved like weather vanes in a shifting wind. Evelyn picked up all 4 feet. She ran the hoof pick around each one, carefully, deliberately narrating everything in a low voice. Shadow's breathing was fast but controlled. Her muscles were tight, but she stood. On the 4th foot, Shadow turned her head and looked at Caleb directly. He didn't move. He just looked back at her steadily, the same way he looked at most things, like he had enough time for whatever was happening. Shadow blew out a long breath. Her muscles released by a visible degree. She looked back at Evelyn and waited for whatever came next. Evelyn set the foot down. She straightened up and looked at Caleb over the fence rail. "She's ready," she said. "Call the farrier." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "2 weeks exactly," he said. "I told you." There was something in his expression. Not just surprise, not just acknowledgement, but something that had been building for some time and was now finding a shape. Something that looked, if she let herself read it, like the beginning of the kind of regard that changes things. She looked away first. She always looked away first. But she was smiling when she walked back to the gate, and she didn't try to hide that because there was nobody behind her watching. Or so she thought. Pete was at the corner of the barn with his mouth open. "She let you pick all 4 feet, he said. "She did," Evelyn said. "Tom Riggs said that horse was broken," Pete said. "Said she was past fixing." "Tom Riggs," Evelyn said, "has a habit of deciding something is finished before he's done looking at it." Pete stared at her. Then he looked at the paddock where Shadow stood calm and loose-limbed in the evening air. And then he looked back at Evelyn. "I want to learn how to do that," he said. "Whatever you just did." Evelyn stopped. She looked at the young man with his recovered jacket and his open face and his unguarded admiration, and she felt something warm and practical settle into her chest. "Be here tomorrow morning," she said. 6 o'clock, after breakfast service. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said with the solemnity of someone taking a serious oath. She walked back to the cookhouse. The last of the evening light lay flat and gold across the ranch, and somewhere behind her, she heard Shadow move in the paddock, not running, not charging, not the frantic fence pacing of a trapped thing. Just moving. Just a horse in the evening moving because she wanted to. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The farrier's name was Holt, and he arrived on a Tuesday with 14 fresh stitches in his memory and a jaw set like a man walking back into a burning building. He came down from his wagon, looked at the paddock, looked at Evelyn and said, "You're the widow woman." "Evelyn Carter," she said. "Yes." "They tell me you've been working with her." "For 4 weeks." Holt looked at the paddock again. Shadow was at the far fence, watching the new arrival with her ears in that high alert position. But she wasn't running. She wasn't charging. She was standing and assessing, which was a different thing entirely. "Last time I came," Holt said, "she took a strip out of my arm before I got through the gate." "I know," Evelyn said. "She won't do that today." He looked at her sideways. "You're sure about that?" "I'm sure that if you follow my instructions exactly, she won't do that today," Evelyn said. "I make no promises about what happens if you don't." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are your instructions?" Tom Riggs, standing 6 feet away with his arms crossed, made a sound in his throat. Evelyn did not look at Riggs. "You come in after me. You stay 2 steps behind me at all times. You don't reach for her until I tell you. You don't make sudden movements. You don't raise your voice. And if she moves away, you stop moving and you wait. Everything happens at her pace, not yours." "Ma'am, I've been shoeing horses for 20—" "I know how long you've been shoeing horses," Evelyn said. "This one is different. Are you in or not?" Holt looked at her. He looked at the paddock. He looked at his hands, one of which had a scar running from the base of his thumb to his wrist that was not from Shadow, but was probably informing his current mood. "I'm in," he said. Riggs made the sound in his throat again. "Tom," Caleb said from behind them. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Riggs uncrossed his arms and went somewhere else. They went into the paddock in the order Evelyn had specified. She went first, talking to Shadow, before she was halfway to the mare, the low, continuous murmur that Shadow had come to associate with her and with safety. Shadow's ears tracked Evelyn's voice, like compass needles finding north. She moved toward Evelyn without being called. When Shadow was close enough, Evelyn turned slightly and let the mare see Holt behind her. Shadow's nostrils flared. Her ears went back. Every muscle in her body went to the particular quality of stillness that precedes explosion. "Easy," Evelyn said. To the horse. "Easy. Look at me. Right here." Shadow's ear rotated back toward Evelyn's voice. "He's with me," Evelyn said. "He's with me, and he's going to be quiet, and he's not going to do anything you don't know about first. You hear me? Look at me." The ear came all the way forward. It took 22 minutes for Shadow to let Holt touch her shoulder. It took another 15 for her to stand still for the first foot. Caleb stood at the fence the entire time. Forearms on the rail hat pushed back, doing exactly what Evelyn had asked him to do, being present and easy and real. Pete stood beside him, with his hands in his pockets and his mouth mostly closed, which was an achievement. When Holt set the last shoe and stepped back, he looked like a man who has survived something he expected to kill him. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "Language," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be yes, ma'am." He looked at Shadow, who was now moving freely around the paddock with all four shoes on, lifting her feet with the particular high-stepping interest of a horse, discovering new sounds. "In 20 years I have never—" "She just needed someone to go at her pace," Evelyn said. "That's all." Holt looked at her steadily. "That's not all," he said. "What you did in there, that's not a technique, Mrs. Carter. That's something else." Evelyn didn't answer. She was watching Shadow move, and something in her chest was doing something complicated that she didn't have clean language for, and she was trying to be quiet enough inside herself to feel it fully before it passed. Behind her, from the direction of the fence, she heard Pete say to Caleb, "She did it." And Caleb's voice low and certain, "Yes, she did." What happened next moved faster than any of them were prepared for. Word reached Castor by Thursday. Not because anyone at Reed Ranch had said anything Evelyn hadn't. Caleb hadn't, and Pete had been specifically and firmly asked not to, which he had mostly honored with the exception of 2 people he'd run into at the feed store, who he didn't think counted. They counted. By Friday afternoon, 3 people had come to the ranch fence on various pretexts. A neighbor checking on a fence line dispute that had apparently been resolved 2 months ago. A woman selling preserves who usually sold preserves in town, and a man from the county assessor's office who asked for Caleb, but spent most of his time looking toward the paddock. By Saturday, Eleanor Stanton had sent a letter. Caleb read it at the desk in his study and then set it down and looked at it for a moment. Then he brought it to the cookhouse. "I think you should read this," he said. Evelyn dried her hands. She read it. The letter was 5 paragraphs long and warmly, carefully worded, and what it said beneath the warmth and care was this: that Eleanor Stanton was concerned about the situation at Reed Ranch, that she had heard various reports about the interactions between the ranch owner and the hired cook, that she felt it was her duty as a longtime family friend to share these concerns privately, rather than allow them to circulate further, and that she had a proposal which she felt would address matters to everyone's satisfaction. The proposal was in the 5th paragraph. It was that Evelyn Carter should be helped to find a more suitable position in town. Eleanor knew of a family who needed domestic help, and that the opening this created might allow Caleb to consider receiving visitors of a more socially appropriate nature. Evelyn set the letter down on the cookhouse table. "She means her niece," she said. Caleb looked at her. "How did you know about that?" "Clara Morse told me at the social." Evelyn smoothed the letter with one hand, a gesture she wasn't fully conscious of. "She's not malicious," she said, because she believed it. She genuinely thinks she's managing the situation helpfully. "She's not managing my situation," Caleb said. "I didn't ask her to." I know that. And I'm not. He stopped. His jaw was tight. You're not being managed off this ranch by Eleanor Stanton's social calendar. Evelyn looked at him carefully. Mr. Reed. Caleb, he said. It came out with more force than he'd apparently intended because he paused. We've been working alongside each other for a month. I think we're past Mr. Reed. She was quiet for a moment. Caleb, she said. It felt different in her mouth than she expected. I'm not going anywhere. Not because Mrs. Stanton asked me to. But you should know what people are saying, and you should decide if it causes problems for the ranch that you're not willing to manage. What people say, Caleb said, hasn't changed the quality of the work here, the food, the horses, or anything else that I'm actually responsible for. He picked up the letter. I'm going to write Eleanor back. What will you say? He looked at her. I'll thank her for her concern and tell her the matter is handled. And is it? Yes, he said with the simplicity of a man who has made up his mind about something and is not particularly interested in being argued out of it. Evelyn picked up her dishcloth. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, and there was something in the way he said it, a completeness, a settling that made the cookhouse feel different for a moment, like the air pressure had changed. He left. She stood for a moment. Then she went back to work. The fire started at 2:15 in the morning. Pete smelled it first. He said later that he'd woken up with the smell of it already in the room, thick and wrong, the particular quality of burning grass that is different from burning wood, and carries with it a different kind of urgency. He came out of the bunkhouse at a run and saw the upper pasture lit orange against the black sky. Summer lightning. There'd been a storm building all week, dry and electrical, the kind that delivered current without rain. The grass in the upper pasture had been dry for 3 weeks. The combination was not in retrospect surprising. But there is a difference between a thing that is not surprising and a thing that has happened, and when it has happened at 2 in the morning with 20 horses in the upper pasture, the difference between those two things is a great deal of running. Evelyn was already awake when Pete hit the cookhouse door. She had smelled it 40 seconds before he did and was pulling on her boots. Upper pasture? Pete said, breathing hard. I know. She was past him before he finished the sentence. The ranch woke in stages. Caleb first out of the main house, with his shirt half-buttoned and his expression stripped down to pure function. Then Riggs, then the hands in sequence, and within 4 minutes there were 9 people moving with purpose in different directions. Caleb was issuing orders in a low, rapid voice. Riggs was redirecting 2 hands toward the water pump. Pete was running for the paddock where the workhorses were kept. Evelyn was running for Shadow. She heard Caleb shout her name behind her, but she didn't stop. She heard him shout it again with more force, and she still didn't stop, because she could hear the horses in the upper pasture. That sound, that specific sound. Horses in collective panic. The pitch and rhythm of it, that once heard, cannot be unheld, and she knew that Shadow alone in the far paddock could hear it too. Shadow was running the fence, not the curious low, exploratory pace of their early work. Full running, fence to fence, the flight response overriding everything she'd learned in 4 weeks of patient work, because 4 weeks of patience is not 20 minutes of fire. Evelyn went through the gate. Hey, she said, loud enough to cut through but not sharp enough to escalate. Hey, I'm here. Shadow ran. Shadow. I'm here, Evelyn said again, moving to the center of the paddock, planting herself. I know, I can hear them too. I'm here. Shadow came around the far fence full speed, heading for the corner, and then she saw Evelyn in the middle of the paddock, and she did something remarkable. She didn't stop, not immediately, but she curved. She altered her trajectory the way water alters around a stone, and she came around Evelyn rather than through her, and then she slowed, shaking breathing in explosive bursts. Good girl. Evelyn said, her voice doing the work her hands would do later. Good girl. Come here. Come on. Shadow came. She was trembling so hard, Evelyn could feel it when she put her hand on the mare's neck, a fine all-over shaking, like something in the mare's structure was trying to come apart. Evelyn put her face against the mare's jaw and said nothing. Just breathed. Just let her breath be slow and steady against the mare's skin. Let her own heartbeat be the slow one, the anchor. Behind her, she heard the gate open. "Mrs. Carter." Caleb's voice. Tight with urgency, but controlled. "We need to move the upper pasture horses. The fire's coming down the east ridge. If we don't get them out through the south gate—" "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm coming." "You're not going up there." "I'm the one who can move the herd," she said. "You know I am." A beat of silence that was really a whole conversation. "Riggs and 2 hands are at the south gate," Caleb said. "Pete's bringing the workhorses. You take Shadow." She turned and looked at him. His face in the orange light from the ridge was stripped back to something essential, the part of him that wasn't the grieving widower, or the careful ranch owner, or the man who'd been turned inward on himself like a bad tooth. Just the core of him, which was, she saw now clearly, someone who was not afraid of necessary things. "I'll take Shadow," she said. Getting the saddle on Shadow was 3 minutes of negotiation that felt like 30. Shadow didn't want the saddle. Shadow wanted to run. Evelyn put the saddle on Shadow by doing everything in the wrong order. Blanket first, then cinch talking the whole time, keeping her voice in that register while her hands worked fast and her mind worked faster. And then she was up, and Shadow came off the paddock ground in a movement that was half bolt and half launch, and Evelyn sat it with her legs locked and her hands steady on the reins and said, all right, let's go." Shadow went. The upper pasture was lit along the east ridgeline with fire that was moving faster than Evelyn had expected, pushed by the same dry wind that had refused to bring rain all week. She could feel the heat from 60 yards out. She could feel Shadow feeling it, the mare's whole body, one tight instrument of alarm, but running because Evelyn asked it, and because Shadow had spent 4 weeks learning that what Evelyn asked was survivable. The horses in the upper pasture were bunched at the south end, 20 of them, doing what horses do, in fire holding together, wheeling in collective panic, looking for the gap that wasn't presenting itself. Evelyn rode Shadow in a wide arc around the outside of the herd. She didn't go for them directly. She went wide, and then came in from the north between the horses and the fire, which put her and Shadow between the herd and the worst of what was coming, and she started moving them south. Shadow was extraordinary. That was the word that came to Evelyn later, when she had time for words. In the moment, there was no vocabulary for what the mare did, how she read the herd, how she moved in the exact measure, required pressing at the edges without spooking the center, turning the collective panic into collective movement. Shadow had been bred for this. Somewhere in her history before whatever had happened that had made her impossible, she had been trained for this. And it came back to her now in the heat and the smoke and the orange-lit dark, like a language she had been forced to forget and was suddenly urgently allowed to remember. They got the horses through the south gate in 11 minutes. Riggs was on the other side. He counted them through. Evelyn heard him counting, and when the last one went through, he pushed the gate and it clanged, and he looked up at Evelyn on Shadow's back, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face before. 20, he said. All 20. Close the east fence before the fire reaches it, Evelyn said. Her voice was steady. She was not entirely sure why. If it gets into the south field, on it. He was already moving. Pete, get the south fence. And then over his shoulder back to Evelyn. Good work. 2 words. Just 2 words. But from Tom Riggs in that moment, they landed like something significant. Evelyn turned Shadow and found Caleb 20 yards behind her on one of the workhorses, and he was looking at her the way she had seen him look at very few things, with the full open attention of a man who has stopped trying to manage his reaction because the thing he's reacting to is too large for management. Are you hurt? He said. No. Shadow. Fine. She was... Evelyn stopped. She looked at the mare's neck damp with sweat and heaving with exertion, and felt the thing in her chest do the complicated thing it did when she had run out of adequate language. She was extraordinary, she said. Caleb rode up alongside her. He was close enough that she could see his face clearly, could see the particular expression on it. and she decided not to look at it for too long, because it was doing something to her equilibrium that she wasn't prepared for at 2:40 in the morning after a fire. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without a prefix. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. It was not the thank you of an employer to an employee. The difference was audible, unmistakable. She nodded. She looked away. Shadow moved beneath her restless adrenaline still working through the mare's system. Evelyn let her walk, let the movement be the outlet, and they walked the perimeter of the south fence in the diminishing orange light while the hands worked the east line and the fire on the ridge began slowly to run out of fuel. Pete appeared at her stirrup somewhere around 3 in the morning. "Is she okay?" He meant Shadow. "She is," Evelyn said. "She was brave." "She wasn't the only one," Pete said. He said it with the guileless directness of someone who doesn't know the weight of what they're saying. "Tom said you rode between the herd and the fire." "That's where I needed to be." "Tom said—" Pete paused. "Tom said he's never seen anyone ride like that, and Tom doesn't say things like that." Evelyn looked down at him. "Go help with the fence, Pete." "Yes, ma'am." He went. But she heard him say something to the hand beside him that included the words, "I told you," with some fervor. Why? By 4 in the morning, the fire was out. By 4:30, the horses were settled. The east fence was patched enough to hold until morning, and the hands were moving toward the bunkhouse with the exhausted efficiency of people who have done emergency work before and know that sleep is the next required task. Evelyn was still in the paddock with Shadow when Caleb found her. She had unsaddled the mare and was running her hands over Shadow's legs, checking for injury. Not because she expected to find anything, but because it was what you did, because care was a practice and not just a feeling. Shadow stood with her head low and her eyes soft. The particular depth of relaxation that comes after extreme stress, the body's relief at still being alive. "Anything," Caleb said. "Clean," Evelyn said. "She's perfectly sound." He crouched beside her at Shadow's near foreleg, looking at what she was checking. And for a moment, they were both crouched beside the horse in the dark, with their hands on the same animal and the same concern. And the proximity was, she was aware of it. She thought he was too. "You should have waited for the workhorse," he said. His voice was quiet, the anger in it, more like something that had been fear and was converting. Going in on Shadow before she was fully, there wasn't time for the workhorse. There was 30 seconds. 20 horses were panicking, and the fire was on the east ridge, Evelyn said. "I made a judgment." "You made a dangerous judgment." "I made the right one," she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. He was quiet. His hand was near hers on Shadow's leg. Neither of them moved. "Yes," he said finally. "You did." Shadow turned her head and looked at both of them with heavy, satisfied eyes, the look of a horse that has done something hard and knows it. She huffed out a breath that pushed warm air across Evelyn's face. Evelyn laughed, small, tired reel. "You're welcome," she said to the horse. Caleb looked at her then. At the side of her face, in the pre-dawn dark, at the laugh that was still in the corner of her mouth, at whatever was in her expression, that she wasn't fully managing in her exhaustion. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "Eleanor Stanton's letter," he said. "The one about the one with the proposal." "Yes. I wrote her back the same day. I told you I would." "I know. What I didn't tell you," he said, "was what exactly I wrote." He paused. "I told her that the situation at Reed Ranch was not a situation. I told her that Evelyn Carter was the most capable person on this property and possibly in this county, and that any attempts to move her along would be met with my personal and continued disagreement." He stopped. "I told her that." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that I said it," he said, "before the fire, before tonight. Not because of what you did tonight, because it was already true." The pre-dawn was very quiet. Shadow breathed slowly between them. "Caleb," Evelyn said, You don't have to. I know I don't, she said. I'm choosing to. She looked at him with the full direct attention she usually rationed carefully. Thank you. For saying it. For saying it before. He held her gaze for a moment with those still brown eyes, and something in them was not still at all, was moving, turning, arriving somewhere. Then Shadow pushed her nose between them, with the determined lack of subtlety of a horse, who has decided she is not receiving adequate attention. And Evelyn laughed again, and the moment shifted into something easier, something that had room for breath. She's jealous, Evelyn said. She is. Caleb agreed, and there was that almost smile, a little more realized now, a little more practiced. I can't say I blame her. Evelyn stood up. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She looked at the sky, which was beginning at the far edge to suggest the possibility of morning. Go sleep, she said. You have fence work in 3 hours. So do you. I don't sleep much, she said. He stood too. He was very close in the narrow space beside Shadow. Why not? She looked at him. The honest answer was long and made of grief and the particular cruelty of the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when absence becomes loudest. She gave him a shorter version. The quiet, she said. Takes some getting used to. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. It does. They walked back toward the main buildings in the early dark, not touching, but close enough that the warmth of the other was present, and Shadow followed them to the paddock gate, and stood watching them go, with her ears in the forward position of something that has decided to pay attention. At the fork between the bunkhouse and the main house, Caleb stopped. Evelyn, he said. Get some sleep, she said without turning around. She heard him stand there for a moment. Then she heard his boots on the path toward the main house. She walked to the bunkhouse and lay down in the narrow dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle back into its ordinary sounds, horses and wind and the distant creak of the east fence, and she felt the night's full weight land on her at last. The fear she hadn't had time for. The relief she hadn't had time for. The thing she still didn't have adequate language for that lived alongside the grief, rather than replacing it, that had Caleb Reed's voice saying, I told her that before, in the specific quality of dark that tells the truth. She was asleep before she finished the thought. In the paddock, Shadow stood in the early light with all 4 shoes on the ground, and her ears at ease, and she was the most beautiful thing on the ranch, and she knew it, and she had earned it. The morning after the fire, Castor County woke up and started talking. That was the nature of small places. Catastrophe and miracle traveled at the same speed, and the story of a widow woman riding an unbreakable horse through smoke and flame to save 20 animals from Reed Ranch's upper pasture had enough elements to keep the feed store and the church steps busy for a week. By Tuesday, the story had been told enough times that it had acquired details nobody had actually witnessed. By Wednesday, some versions had Evelyn riding through the fire itself. By Thursday, Tom Riggs, who had told exactly 2 people, both of whom he trusted, neither of whom had honored that trust, heard a version of the story so embellished that he barely recognized it, and spent the afternoon in a state of mixed outrage and reluctant pride. Evelyn heard the versions filtering back through Pete, who collected them, like a man stacking firewood enthusiastically and without particular discrimination. They're saying you jumped a burning fence, Pete reported on Thursday morning. I didn't jump any fence. I know that. I was there. He paused. It was a good story, though. All the best stories have a burning fence in them, Evelyn said. Eat your breakfast. What she didn't tell Pete was that the stories worried her, not the embellishments. She had lived long enough to be unsurprised by what gossip did to facts. What worried her was Eleanor Stanton, who had not responded to Caleb's letter, and whose silence was a different kind of weather than her previous noise. Evelyn had grown up around women like Eleanor, women who went quiet when they were planning, not when they were finished. She was right to worry. The letter arrived on Friday afternoon, addressed not to Caleb, but to the Castor County Sheriff's Office, and a copy to the County Land Office, and a copy to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne. Evelyn didn't know this when it arrived. She found out the way she found out most things, through the particular quality of silence that fell over the main house after Caleb read something at his desk. She was in the cookhouse when he came through the door. He had the look of a man who has received a blow and is deciding how to absorb it before he tells anyone. "Sit down," Evelyn said immediately. He sat. He put a folded paper on the table. "Eleanor Stanton," he said, "has written to the county sheriff. She has enclosed a letter she says it was sent to her by a business contact in Denver that alleges you left your homestead under circumstances that were, in her word, irregular." Evelyn went very still. "The letter claims," Caleb continued, his voice careful and deliberate, "that you left debts unpaid. That Walter's death involved it implies you received a life insurance settlement under disputed circumstances. It says—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "It calls you a woman of opportunistic character who has a pattern of attaching herself to men of property following bereavement." The cookhouse was very quiet. "That's a lie," Evelyn said. "I know that. Every word of it." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "Do you—" He met her eyes directly. "Yes, I do." No hesitation. "But the sheriff will need to look into it. He doesn't have a choice. It was submitted formally, and the territorial paper Eleanor sent them the same letter." Evelyn felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. She had fought for 5 weeks to build something real in this place, the cookhouse, the horses, shadow, the beginning of whatever was forming between herself and the man across the table, and Eleanor Stanton had taken all of it and put it in a formal letter and sent it to the one institution in Castor County with the power to end everything. "Where did she get the letter?" Evelyn said. "The one from Denver. She says a business contact." "Which contact?" Caleb looked at the paper. "A man named Aldous Fitch. He claims to be a land broker who dealt with properties in your area after Walter died." Evelyn knew that name. She knew it the way you know the name of a splinter that has been working its way toward the surface for months. Aldous Fitch had come to her 3 weeks after Walter's burial with papers that he said represented a generous offer for the homestead property, and Evelyn had told him the property was not for sale, and Aldous Fitch had stood on her porch and told her that a woman alone with debts and winter coming would find her options narrowing, and Evelyn had told him to get off her property, and he had gone. And 3 weeks later she had packed everything she owned and driven Patience 6 miles to Reed Ranch because winter was indeed coming, and her options were indeed narrowing, but on her own terms, not his. "Aldous Fitch," she said, "tried to buy my homestead for 1/3 of its value 3 weeks after my husband died. When I refused, he implied he could make the refusal complicated. I left before he had the chance." Caleb was watching her steadily. "There were no debts." "There were debts," she said. "A homestead has debts. They were Walter's and mine together, and they were documented, and they were being paid." She met his gaze. "I did not take an insurance payment under disputed circumstances. I took what Walter left me, which was the homestead, and a small policy he'd carried for 12 years, and I paid what we owed, and I came here." "Can you prove that—" "I have documents," she said. "At the land office in Holt County. The homestead records, the payment history, the policy documentation, all of it." She paused. "But I need someone to request them. Formally. Before the sheriff meets with Eleanor Stanton's version of events." Caleb stood up. "I'll ride to Holt County tomorrow." "That's a day and a half each way." "I know." "Caleb." "Evelyn." He said her name the same way he'd said it in the pre-dawn after the fire, with the full weight of it, with intention. "This is not a complicated decision. You've told me what's true. I believe you. The documents will confirm it." He picked up the paper from the table. "Eleanor Stanton is not a bad woman. But Aldous Fitch is using her, and she's going to feel very foolish when she understands that." "You can't know that for certain," Evelyn said quietly. "You've known me 5 weeks." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you rode between 20 panicking horses and a fire on a horse nobody else could get near," he said. "I know you rebuilt this cookhouse in 4 days without telling anyone you were doing it. I know you told Tom Riggs to his face that he was wrong more than once, and you were right every time. I know." He stopped, started again. I know that every time I've watched you make a judgment, it's been the right judgment. 5 weeks is enough time to know that." Evelyn looked at the table. She pressed her hands flat against it the way she did when she was managing something internal that needed managing. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He left before supper to make arrangements for the ride. Evelyn cooked supper and said nothing to the men and lay awake in the narrow bunkhouse room afterward, not sleeping, listening to the ranch sounds and thinking about Aldous Fitch and his papers, and the particular cruelty of a man who would weaponize a widow's grief to get what he wanted from her land. What nobody expected was that Tom Riggs would be the one to change everything. He came to Evelyn's Saturday morning before breakfast, which was early enough that the cookhouse still smelled of last night's fire in the stove and nothing else. He came through the door without knocking, which was unusual enough that Evelyn turned around immediately. He was holding a piece of paper. "I got a letter," he said, "from a man named Cole Danver. He's a cattleman from the North Range. He was Walter Carter's neighbor for 6 years. He set the paper on the prep table. He heard about the fire and heard your name, and he wrote to me because somebody told him you were working here." Evelyn looked at the letter without touching it. "He says," Riggs continued, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he was working against his own habitual resistance, "that Walter Carter ran the cleanest operation on the North Range. That you were the one who kept the horses. That when Walter got sick, the winter before he died, it was you who worked the property alone for 4 months. And that when Aldous Fitch came around after the burial, trying to acquire the property cheap, every neighbor on the North Range knew it, and every one of them thought it was a disgrace." He stopped. "He writes he'd be willing to say as much to anyone who needed to hear it." Evelyn looked up from the letter to Tom Riggs's face. His jaw was working. His eyes were direct. "I made up my mind about you wrong," he said. "In the beginning, I had a way of thinking about certain things that wasn't—" He stopped, started again with the blunt directness of a man who has not practiced at apology, but is doing it anyway. "I was wrong. About you being here. About what you could do. About Shadow." He paused. "And I should have said it before Eleanor Stanton put her nose in." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Riggs," she said. Tom. She picked up Cole Danvers' letter. "I need you to ride this to the sheriff's office before Eleanor Stanton's meeting this morning. It needs to get there first." Something crossed his face. Relief, she thought, at being given something direct to do, something that required action, rather than the harder work of standing still and being accountable. "When's her meeting?" he said. 10 o'clock. It's in the county notice. I saw it yesterday." He looked at the clock on the cookhouse wall. It was 6:45. "I'll be there by 9, he said. He picked up the letter. He went to the door. He stopped. "I need you to know," he said without turning around, "that it wasn't just me who was wrong. Most of the county was wrong. Some of them are going to have a harder time saying it." "I know," Evelyn said. "That don't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He left. She heard him in the yard, heard him calling for a horse, heard the sound of the ranch responding to his urgency. She stood in the cookhouse and breathed for a moment. Then she made breakfast for 30 minutes by herself because the work was there and the work was real, and she had learned over 5 weeks and 25 years that the best thing to do when the world was deciding something about you was to keep doing the thing you were actually there to do. Shad. The sheriff's name was Aldridge, and he was not an unkind man. He arrived at Reed Ranch at 2 in the afternoon with his deputy and Cole Danvers' letter already in his inside pocket, and the particular expression of a man who has spent his morning reconsidering the meeting he thought he was going to have. Evelyn met him at the gate, not because she'd been told to, because she decided to. Caleb wasn't back yet from Holt County. He wouldn't be back until tomorrow at the earliest. And Evelyn had spent the morning thinking about what Walter would have said about waiting for someone else to handle your own name. And what Walter would have said was, "Evelyn Rose Carter, you have 2 working legs and a working mind, and nobody's going to speak for you better than you speak for yourself." "Mrs. Carter," Sheriff Aldridge said. He touched his hat. "Sheriff," she said, "I believe you received a letter from a man named Cole Danver this morning." I did. And you've also received a letter from Eleanor Stanton that makes certain allegations. That's correct? I'd like to address those allegations directly, she said. If you're willing. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. I'm willing, he said. They sat on the porch, not in the house because this was not a social call, and she wanted it on record as something that happened in the open air, where anyone could see. Pete appeared without being asked and stayed at the corner of the porch in the way he'd developed of being present without being intrusive, which was one of several things he'd learned in the past 5 weeks. Evelyn laid it out plainly. The homestead records, Walter's illness, the 4 months she'd worked alone, Aldous Fitch's visit and his offer and his implication, the insurance policy, the payments, the documentation that Caleb was retrieving from Holt County and that would arrive within 2 days. She laid it out the same way she'd rebuilt the cookhouse methodically without drama, without asking for sympathy, just laying each piece in its place until the structure was apparent. When she finished, Sheriff Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to ask you something directly." "All right." Aldous Fitch's letter to Mrs. Stanton mentions a dispute over a horse sale. He says your late husband sold a horse under false pretenses to a buyer in which horse, Evelyn said immediately. Aldridge looked at his paper. A bay gelding 3 years old sold in spring of 1885. Chester, Evelyn said. Walter sold Chester to a man named Dumont, who came from Colorado. Chester was represented accurately and in good health. 6 weeks later, Dumont wrote to say Chester had developed a hoof condition. Walter offered to return the payment. Dumont refused the return and kept the horse. She paused. If Aldous Fitch is calling that a disputed sale, he is using a resolved disagreement as a fraudulent allegation. I have the correspondence. It will be in the records Caleb is retrieving. Aldridge folded his paper. I don't think, he said carefully, that this situation is what Mrs. Stanton believed it to be. Eleanor Stanton is not a bad woman, Evelyn said. She was provided inaccurate information by a man who had a financial interest in damaging my reputation. She acted on it in good faith. She looked at the sheriff directly. I'd ask that any formal response account for that. She doesn't need to be made to look foolish. She just needs to know the truth. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. You're being generous, he said. I'm being practical, Evelyn said. I have to live in this county. Eleanor Stanton is part of this county. Making an enemy of her doesn't benefit anyone. Pete at the corner of the porch made the sound he made when he was impressed, but was trying to look like he hadn't been listening. Aldridge stood. He put his hat back on. Mrs. Carter, he said, when those Holt County records arrive, I'd ask that you or Mr. Reed bring them to my office. I'll close the formal inquiry at that point. He paused. For what it's worth, what you did the other night with those horses, my brother-in-law has a place 2 miles from the East Ridge. He would have lost his fence line if that fire had gotten to the south field. You stopped it from getting there. Evelyn looked at him. I just moved the horses. Yes, ma'am, he said. You just moved the horses. He touched his hat again. Good day. She watched him ride away. She sat on the porch for a moment longer than was necessary. Pete came and stood beside her. You all right? He said. I'm fine. You didn't eat breakfast, he said. I noticed. She looked at him. You noticed. I notice things, Pete said with some dignity. I've been learning to notice things. She almost smiled. There's biscuits left from this morning. I know, he said. I saved you some. He produced them from his jacket pocket with the triumphant expression of someone who has anticipated a need and met it. I wrapped them in cloth so they'd stay warm. She looked at the biscuits. She looked at Pete. She thought 5 weeks ago I walked through that gate alone, and I did not know any of these people, and now here is this young man who saved me biscuits. Thank you, Pete, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She ate the biscuits on the porch and looked at the road where Aldridge's wagon had disappeared, and she felt the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained effort of being. For a long time, the only person standing between yourself and what the world was trying to decide about you. The relief of it was enormous and quiet, The way relief often is not a wave, but a tide going out, leaving solid ground. Caleb came back Sunday at dusk. He came through the ranch gate with his horse tired and his saddlebag full of documents from the Holt County Land Office, and he found Evelyn at the paddock fence with Shadow, which was where he had come to understand she would be at dusk, and he stood beside her, without speaking for a moment. "The sheriff came yesterday," she said. He went very still. "Evelyn, I handled it," she said. "I wasn't here. I know you weren't here." She looked at him steadily. "I handled it." He looked at her. In the fading light, his face was doing the thing it had started doing more frequently. Being open, being present, not managing itself quite as carefully as it had managed itself in the beginning. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. The Sheriff Cole Danvers letter. The direct conversation, the allegation about Chester, the bay gelding, what she'd said about Eleanor Stanton. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, that he listened to the end before he responded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You told Aldridge that Eleanor should be protected from embarrassment," he said. "Yes." "After what she did, after what she was told to do," Evelyn said. "There's a difference. Aldous Fitch used her. That's Fitch's fault." He was quiet again. Shadow moved between them at the fence, pushing her nose toward Caleb's hand, with the comfortable presumption of a horse who has decided someone is trustworthy, and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He let her absently his eyes on Evelyn. "The documents are in my bag," he said. "They confirm everything. Payment records, the policy, the Chester correspondence. All of it." "Good," she said. "The sheriff needs them tomorrow." "I'll take them in the morning." He paused. "Evelyn, you keep saying my name like that," she said, "and one of us is going to have to say whatever comes after it." He was quiet for a moment. Shadow's ear rotated between them as though she were following the conversation. "I wrote to Eleanor Stanton once," he said, "when I meant to say something to you." She looked at him. "I should have said it to you directly," he said, "that you're the most capable person on this property, that what you've done here with Shadow, with the ranch, with the fire, with whatever you just did sitting on that porch with the sheriff." He stopped. "It's not just competence. It's you do things right, at the level of how things ought to be done. And this ranch, He stopped again. She waited. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because of the cook work, not because of Shadow, because—" He looked at her directly, and his eyes were as open as she'd ever seen them. "Because this place is different with you in it. I am different with you in it. And I don't want to go back to what it was before." The ranch was very quiet. Shadow breathed between them. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said. "I told you that." "I know. I'm saying something different than that." She looked at him. The sunset was making everything complicated and honest. "I know you are," she said. "I'm saying I know. I hear you." She put her hand on the fence rail, and his hand was already there, and neither of them moved away. "We should probably go slow," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not entirely certain what I'm doing." "Neither am I," he said. "I haven't been certain of much in 3 years." "We have time," she said. "We have time," he agreed. Shadow pushed her nose between their hands on the fence rail with the absolute indifference to subtlety of an animal who sees two people not paying attention to her and finds this unacceptable. "She's going to be insufferable," Evelyn said. "She already is," Caleb said. "She's been insufferable since you got here. You made her that way." "I made her confident," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." He laughed again. The short, real, slightly unpracticed laugh that she had come to listen for. Shadow's ear rotated toward it, with the satisfied air of a horse who has caused something good to happen. The evening came down over Reed Ranch with the slow particular weight of a summer day, releasing its heat, and the two people at the paddock fence stood with their hands nearly touching in the dusk, and between them the black mare stood easy and shod and unafraid. And tomorrow there would be documents to deliver and a formal inquiry to close, and a man named Aldous Fitch who would find that the widow he'd tried to corner had not stayed cornered. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the ranch was quiet. Tonight was enough. The documents arrived at Sheriff Aldridge's office on Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Aldous Fitch's carefully constructed story had the structural integrity of wet paper. Caleb delivered them himself. He rode into Castor with the saddlebag and set the records on Aldridge's desk, one by one: the payment history, the insurance policy, the Chester correspondence, the homestead deed transfer, the signed statements from the Holt County Land Office, and let the paper speak in the way paper speaks when it has been kept honestly. Aldridge read through them without saying much. His deputy stood in the corner and said nothing at all. When Aldridge finished, he set the last document down and looked at Caleb steadily. "These are clean," he said. "They are," Caleb said. "Fitch's letter claims disputed debt. There's no disputed debt here. There's a paid-off account and a legitimate insurance policy and a horse sale that was resolved by the seller's own offer to return payment." Aldridge leaned back. "What I'd like to know is how Aldous Fitch got Eleanor Stanton's ear." "I'd like to know that too," Caleb said. "I have some thoughts," Aldridge said. "Fitch has been working the North Range for 2 years. He acquires properties from widows and struggling homesteaders at below market value and resells them to a land consortium out of Denver. He's done it 4 times that I know of. The homestead Evelyn Carter refused to sell him. It sits on the only water access point for 3 adjacent properties he's already bought." He paused. If he could discredit her enough to force a sale or a legal complication, he could acquire it through a third party while she was occupied defending herself. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's not a misunderstanding," he said. "That's deliberate." "That's deliberate," Aldridge confirmed. He closed the folder. "I'm going to make some inquiries. About Fitch, about his other acquisitions. This isn't the first letter he's written to people of standing in various counties." He looked at Caleb. "The formal inquiry against Mrs. Carter is closed as of today. No findings, no record." "What about Eleanor Stanton?" Aldridge sighed, the sigh of a man who has to deliver an uncomfortable truth to someone who doesn't fully deserve the discomfort. "I'll speak to her personally," he said. "She acted on information she believed was credible. She was wrong. She'll know that by end of day." Caleb stood and shook Aldridge's hand. He was at the door when Aldridge said, "Read." He turned. "She came here herself on Saturday," Aldridge said. "Mrs. Carter, she didn't wait for you. She sat on that porch and laid out every fact she had, and she did it without—" He paused, choosing his word. "Without anger. She was clear as water." He looked at Caleb with the direct gaze of a man who has spent 20 years reading people for a living. "That's not a common thing." "No," Caleb said. "It isn't." He rode back to the ranch with the empty saddlebag and the particular feeling of a thing resolved, not the explosive relief of a crisis averted at the last moment, but the quieter, more lasting relief of justice done properly, step by documented step. Eleanor Stanton came to Reed Ranch on Wednesday. She came alone. No driver, no pretense of a social call. Just a woman in a black dress driving her own buggy up the ranch road with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has decided to set it down regardless of the cost. Evelyn saw her coming from the cookhouse window. She dried her hands. She went out to meet her. They stood in the ranch yard, the two of them, without preamble. "I was used," Eleanor said. It came out without decoration, which was not Eleanor Stanton's usual register, and the plainness of it said more than an elaborate apology would have. "Aldous Fitch came to me 6 weeks ago with that letter and a very convincing account of your history, and I believed him because I—" She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "Because I had already decided what I thought about your situation here, and the letter confirmed what I had already decided. That is not his fault. That is mine." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "He targeted you," she said. He needed someone with standing to make the allegation credible. He picked you deliberately. That does not excuse my judgment. No, Evelyn agreed. It doesn't, but it explains it. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression shifted the rigid composure that was her social armor loosening by 1 degree. I want you to know, she said, that I have spoken to the territorial newspaper. They will not run the story. I also spoke to the 3 women I told privately, directly. She paused. I told them I was wrong. Evelyn understood what that cost. For a woman of Eleanor Stanton's position and pride, saying I was wrong to 3 women in the ladies' auxiliary was not a small thing. It was in its way an act of courage. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't thank me. I created the problem. Eleanor looked at her steadily. I also owe you an answer to a question I never let you ask. My niece from Philadelphia. She stopped. She is a perfectly lovely young woman who has no interest in Wyoming and would have been miserable here. I was managing a situation that was not mine to manage. She looked away briefly. Caleb Reed has been my late husband's friend's son since he was 12 years old. I watched his wife die. I watched what it did to him. I wanted... Her voice did something careful. I wanted to fix it. That is not the same as knowing how to fix it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Clara Morse had said at the social. She thought about the 5 weeks of this woman's interference and the damage it had nearly done. And she thought about Walter, who had always said that the people who cause harm out of love are the hardest to be angry at, because they're also the easiest to understand. Would you like coffee? Evelyn said. Eleanor blinked. I beg your pardon. Coffee. I was about to make a pot. It's a reasonable hour for it. Evelyn turned toward the cookhouse. Come in or don't. Either is fine. A pause. Then Eleanor Stanton's boots on the ground behind her. She came in. They drank coffee at the cookhouse table without performance, without social mechanics, just 2 women in a room with a complicated history between them and the coffee between them, more honest than most conversations Evelyn had managed with Eleanor to date. Eleanor asked about Shadow. Evelyn told her without embellishment what the work had been. Eleanor listened in a way she had not listened before, not to respond, not to manage, but just to hear. My husband had a horse like that, Eleanor said finally. After he died, nobody could get near the animal. I had it put down. She was quiet for a moment. I've wondered about that decision for 8 years. Evelyn looked at her. You didn't know, she said. You can't make the right call on something you don't have the information for. Eleanor looked at her coffee. You're generous with people who don't deserve it. I'm practical, Evelyn said, which was what she'd told the sheriff because it was the truest version of it. Generosity I can't afford, practicality I can. Something in Eleanor's expression moved in a way that looked, if Evelyn was reading it right, like the beginning of genuine regard. Not the social kind, the real kind. The formal inquiry closing was published in the county notice on Thursday, a single paragraph that said less than it meant, and was read by everyone in Castor County who had been following the situation, which was most of them. What it said was no findings, case closed. What it meant was the widow was clean, and the man who'd tried to dirty her name was not. The responses came to the way watershed events come in small communities, not all at once, but steadily, in the days following, each one carrying the weight of a community recalibrating. Cole Danver rode down from the North Range and shook Evelyn's hand in the ranch yard and said, Walter would have been proud. She could not speak for a moment. She shook his hand and nodded, and he didn't ask her to say anything, which was exactly the right thing. Holt the farrier sent a note. It said only, If you ever need a reference, I'll give one. Holt. Evelyn folded it and put it in her apron pocket and carried it there for a week. 3 women from the ladies' auxiliary came by on Friday. Not Eleanor's doing. They said their own idea with a covered dish and a manner that was slightly too careful to be natural, but was trying very hard to be genuine. And Evelyn received them at the cookhouse table and fed them biscuits and was gracious in the way that costs something, but is worth the cost. Tom Riggs said nothing about any of it, but on Friday morning he fixed the fence post outside the cookhouse that had been listing since before Evelyn arrived and that she had been meaning to mention for 3 weeks. He fixed it without comment and went on with his day. She didn't mention it, neither did he. But when their paths crossed that afternoon, he gave her the nod, the specific nod that working people in that era and that culture use when words are insufficient and unnecessary, and she returned it, and that was the end of the longest argument she and Tom Riggs had ever had without actually having it. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on the following Monday, and it came from the direction that had seemed least likely. Aldous Fitch, apparently unaware that Aldridge had been making inquiries, arrived in Castor County with a new set of papers and a lawyer from Denver, and filed a claim at the land office asserting that the Carter homestead property, the one Evelyn had left behind, the one he'd been trying to acquire for 2 years, had a lien against it from an unresolved debt predating Walter Carter's death. The claim was fraudulent. Everyone who needed to know that knew it within 48 hours, because Aldridge had been preparing for exactly this and had a counterfiling ready. But the existence of the claim meant the homestead was now in formal dispute, which meant it could not be sold or transferred while the dispute was active, which meant Aldous Fitch had effectively tied it up in legal limbo, which was, Aldridge told Caleb grimly, probably his intention all along. If he couldn't acquire it clean, he'd acquire it complicated. Caleb came to the cookhouse that Monday evening and told Evelyn what had happened. She stood very still for a moment. "The homestead," she said. "He's going after the homestead." "He's trying to cloud the title," Caleb said. "Aldridge has the counterfiling already prepared, but it means a hearing. Territorial court. Probably within the month. I'll need to testify." Yes. She was quiet for a moment, working through it, the shape of it, the specific cruelty of a man who would not let go, who would follow a widow from one county to the next, and keep reaching for what she'd refused to give him. Something hardened in her chest. Not fear. Something older than fear, and more useful. "What does Aldridge need from me?" she said. "Your testimony, the same documents, and," Caleb paused, "he's going to subpoena Fitch's other acquisition records, 3 other families who sold to him in the past 2 years. Aldridge thinks if he can show the pattern, the same approach, the same allegations, the same pressure tactics, the territorial judge will see it for what it is." "The other families," Evelyn said. "Do they know?" "Aldridge is contacting them. They'll be afraid," she said. "They sold under pressure. Coming forward means admitting they were pressured. That's not easy for people who thought they had no choice." Caleb looked at her. "No," he said. "It isn't." "I want to write to them," she said. "Before Aldridge contacts them formally. I want them to hear from someone who is in the same position and didn't sell." She looked at him steadily. Would that help or hurt the case? He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I'd ask Aldridge." "Then let's ask Aldridge." They rode into Castor the next morning side by side, which was the first time they had ridden anywhere together in a manner that was visible to anyone who happened to be on the main road, which several people were. Evelyn noted the looks and did not adjust her posture or her pace. Neither did Caleb. Aldridge said the letters would help. He said it with the particular emphasis of a man who has been building a legal case and has just been handed something he didn't know he needed. Evelyn wrote 3 letters that afternoon at the cookhouse table, one for each family Aldridge named. She wrote them the way she would have wanted to be written to, plainly without pity, with the specific information that they were not alone, and that there was a path through that did not require giving Aldous Fitch what he wanted. She sealed them and gave them to Aldridge. 2 of the 3 families responded within the week. The 3rd responded 10 days later after their neighbors had already agreed to testify. The territorial hearing was held on the 3rd Thursday of August in a courtroom in Cheyenne that smelled of wood polish and old decisions. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table with Aldridge's lawyer and her documents, and the particular quality of calm that she had found in the past 2 months was available to her when the stakes were high enough. The same quality that had let her sit in the middle of the paddock while Shadow ran the fence. The same quality that had let her face the sheriff on her own porch and lay out the truth piece by piece. Caleb sat in the gallery. He had ridden 4 hours to be there. He had not made a production of it. He had simply arrived. Tom Riggs had come too, which nobody had expected, including Tom Riggs, who explained his presence by saying he had business in Cheyenne, which was not true in any verifiable sense, but was not challenged by anyone. Pete had asked to come and had been told kindly that someone needed to stay and run the ranch, and had accepted this with the solemnity of a person given an important assignment. Aldous Fitch's lawyer was a polished man from Denver who had the manner of someone accustomed to winning, which is a different thing from being right. He made his opening argument about the lien with the confidence of a man who has filed enough fraudulent paperwork to know that paperwork looks like truth when presented well. The first family testified. A husband and wife from the North Range who had sold their water access property to Fitch for a third of its value after he'd produced a document claiming they owed him money from a transaction that had never occurred. They were nervous on the stand. Their voices shook. But they said what had happened in plain words, and the words had the unmistakable quality of things that are true. The second family testified. A widow woman from 2 counties over who had sold her late husband's grazing land after Fitch had told her the county would seize it for back taxes. Taxes she had in fact already paid. She produced the payment receipt on the stand. Fitch's lawyer objected. The judge looked at the receipt and overruled him. Then Evelyn testified. She told the truth. She told it in the same register she had used on the sheriff's porch, clear as water, factual, without anger, without performance. She told it about Walter's death and the burial, and Fitch's arrival 3 weeks later. She told it about the papers and the implied threats, and the way he had described her options to her on her own porch, as though her choices were his to define. She told it about the insurance policy, and the payment records, and the Chester correspondence, and every document that contradicted every lie Aldous Fitch had put in writing. Fitch's lawyer cross-examined her for 20 minutes. He implied she had misremembered. He implied she had misunderstood. He implied she was a grieving widow whose recollection was perhaps not the most reliable accounting of events. Evelyn looked at him steadily through all of it. "I'm not misremembering," she said. "I'm not misunderstanding. And my grief, while real, has not affected my ability to recall what a man said to me on my own porch." She paused. "Would you like me to repeat it again? I can repeat it as many times as you need." The lawyer sat down. Caleb in the gallery did not move. But Tom Riggs beside him made the sound in his throat a different version of the sound he usually made. This one, unmistakably the sound of someone who has just witnessed something they consider excellent. The judge ruled that afternoon. He ruled that Fitch's lien was fraudulent, that the claim was dismissed with prejudice, and that the Carter homestead title was clear and unencumbered. He also ruled, based on the pattern of 3 separate fraudulent filings in 3 separate counties, that Aldous Fitch's land acquisition practices warranted investigation by the Territorial Land Office, an investigation that Aldridge had already begun, and that would over the following months result in Fitch losing his broker's license and returning to Denver to face questions that would keep him occupied and largely harmless for a very long time. When the gavel came down, the courtroom was briefly completely quiet. Then Evelyn picked up her documents and put them in their folder, and folded her hands on top of the folder, and breathed out once, slowly. Caleb was at the rail of the gallery when she turned. He looked at her across the courtroom, the way he had looked at her in the pre-dawn after the fire, openly without managing it. She looked back. They rode home in the late afternoon. Caleb and Evelyn with Tom Riggs, a few lengths behind in the particular configuration of a man who is giving people space, while technically being present, which was a new skill for Riggs, and one he was practicing with some effort. An hour outside of Castor, Caleb said, "The homestead." "Yes," Evelyn said. "It's yours now. Clear title, no disputes." He paused. "What do you want to do with it?" She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the hearing was scheduled in the quiet early mornings before the cookhouse came alive, turning the question over the way you turn something in your hands to find its shape. "I want to sell it," she said. "Properly, for what it's worth." She looked at the road ahead. "And I want to use the proceeds to buy a proper stake in the horse operation." Caleb was quiet. "You've been running cattle because your father ran cattle." she said. "But this county needs good horses more than it needs more cattle. The horses you have, Shadow especially, there's breeding potential there that you're not using. And the demand from the Army remount program and the ranches up north?" She stopped. "I've been watching the books you leave on your desk." He looked at her. "You've been reading my account books. You left them out," she said. "I notice things. Pete's been learning, but I've been doing it longer." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "A stake in the horse operation. A fair stake. Documented. Legal." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering a business arrangement with someone who knows horses and has demonstrated that knowledge over the course of a summer." "And if I said yes to the business arrangement," he said carefully, "would you stay?" She looked at him. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." "You told me that when we were talking about Eleanor Stanton," he said. "I'm asking you something different now." The road was empty ahead of them. The summer day was going down gold over the Wyoming grass, and somewhere behind them, Tom Riggs had made the decision to fall back another 20 lengths, because Tom Riggs had, over the course of one summer, become a man who understood when something was happening that he should not interrupt. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I would stay." Caleb reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any performance, just the straightforward gesture of a man who has decided something and is acting on the decision, and held it for a moment on the road between Cheyenne and home. She let him. His hand was warm and work-roughened and entirely real, and she held it back. 6 months later, Reed Ranch had changed in ways that the ranch hands described as practical, and that Pete described as something considerably more romantic in the letter he wrote to his mother in Missouri, a letter his mother read twice, and then read aloud to his aunt. The horse operation had a proper name, Carter Reed Stock, filed at the county land office in October. The former Carter homestead had sold in September to a young couple from Nebraska for full market value, and the proceeds had gone where Evelyn had said they would go. The account books were balanced in a handwriting that alternated between Caleb's and Evelyn's, because they had developed the habit of reviewing them together in the evening, which was more efficient and also served as a reason to sit at the same table for an hour each night, without anyone needing to construct a justification. Shadow had 3 appointments from ranchers interested in her bloodlines for breeding purposes. She received all visitors to the paddock with the tolerant condescension of a horse who knows her own worth and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Tom Riggs had asked Evelyn in November if she would teach a young hand named Marcus what she knew about horse gentling. She had said yes. He had said thank you in the gruff, abbreviated manner of a man who finds gratitude physically uncomfortable, and she had accepted it in the gruff, abbreviated manner of a woman who has stopped requiring more than what is offered sincerely. It was enough. More than enough. Eleanor Stanton came to the ranch for supper in December. Her idea, her request delivered through a formal note that had been more genuine than formal. She had brought a jar of her own preserves, which were excellent, and had spent an hour after supper asking Evelyn questions about the horse operation, with the focused interest of a woman who, when she is not managing other people's lives, is actually quite intelligent. She had also quietly provided a testimonial letter for Carter Reed Stock to 2 ranching families in the northern county who were looking for quality horses. She had not announced this. Caleb had found out through Aldridge, who found out from one of the families. He had not mentioned it to Eleanor. Some things were better acknowledged by the result than by the conversation. On the morning of the first hard frost, Evelyn stood in the paddock with Shadow and felt the change in the air, the way you feel it when something true has settled into its right place, not with trumpets, not with declaration, but with the deep, structural quiet of a thing that has found its foundation and knows it will hold. She heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. She did not need to turn around. Caleb came and stood beside her. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, hers, the way she took it, no sugar, and he handed it over without ceremony. The way you hand something to a person whose preferences you know completely, because you have been paying attention for long enough that their preferences have become part of the structure of your days. "Shadow's put on good condition for winter," he said. "She has," Evelyn agreed. "Marcus did well with her yesterday. He's learning fast. He has the patience for it. They drank their coffee. Shadow moved between them with the comfortable authority of an animal who has been the center of two people's attention for 6 months and fully intends to continue. "I wrote to Cole Danver this morning," Caleb said, "about the spring breeding inquiry." "Good. He's got 3 mares that would cross well with Shadow's bloodline." "That's what I told him." More coffee. The frost on the fence rail. The mare breathing in the cold air and making the small sounds horses make when they are simply themselves, when they are not afraid, and not performing when they have arrived finally at the life they were always supposed to have. Evelyn looked at the ranch, the fence lines, the outbuildings, the smoke from the cookhouse where Pete was apparently making an attempt at biscuits that Evelyn had sanctioned and was only partly worried about, and she felt with the clarity of something genuinely known, rather than merely hoped that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where grief had been trying to strand her. Not where Aldous Fitch had tried to trap her. Not where Eleanor Stanton had tried to redirect her. Exactly where she had walked herself 6 miles at a time, one honest choice at a time from a gate she had refused to slow down for. Caleb's hand found hers on the fence rail. She turned her palm up and held it. "Evelyn Carter Reed," he said. He was trying it out, seeing how it sat. She looked at him sideways. "That's presumptuous," she said. "It is," he agreed. He was not apologizing. She looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at her with those dark, knowing eyes, the eyes of a creature who had been afraid and been patient, and been met by someone willing to go at her pace until trust was no longer a risk, but simply the truth of how things were between them. "Ask me properly," Evelyn said, "and I'll give you a proper answer." Caleb Reed turned to face her on the frozen ground of the ranch that had become hers as surely as it was his, and he asked her properly. She gave him the answer she had known, if she was honest with herself, since the morning she had sat in the dirt of this paddock, with her hand on the face of a frightened horse, and felt her future arrive not as something given to her, but as something she had refused to stop walking toward. She said yes. And that was exactly precisely completely the truth.